Hello and welcome to the second study unit looking at strategy and innovation. In this study unit I'm going to look at disruption and why firms do not respond to changes in their environment. Now in this video I'm going to take a deeper look at what we call dominant designs, as it plays a major role in the theories of disruption. In the next video I'll then look at the theories about why firms actually fail. Now you remember that only one firm out of the Dow Jones Index actually made it through the last century, and we saw failures like Xerox and RCA. More recently, nearer to home, we've seen the failures of Thomas Cook, British Home Stores and Yahoo. We talked about Blockbuster and how it went from being a global successful giant in home entertainment in 2004 to filing for bankruptcy in 2010. But we saw that that failure was not due to the magnitude of technology change or the lack of expertise. Blockbuster knew that online streaming was an important aspect of the future and was able to create its own streaming service, Blockbuster Total Access. And indeed, given its capabilities, chose not to acquire Netflix in 2000. In addition, it was not down to incompetent management. Like all organisations of that size, it can bring in the expertise, it can bring in the management skills it needs, and the board did make senior changes in the Blockbuster management team from 2000 onwards. And indeed what Blockbuster shows is that it is highly unusual for a large firm to fail due to the magnitude of an innovation. Instead, failure seems to be more based within the rigidities and path dependencies that exist within inside the firms. Firms become locked into a self-reinforcing pattern of choices. Their knowledge, skills, resource base, management skills, training and education inform the strategic choices that they make. Those strategic choices then add to those same attributes of the firm. Knowledge in existing areas is enhanced, current behaviours are reinforced, standards, rules and policies more deeply embedded within the firm, which then inform the next tranche of strategic choices, and so that continues to reinforce the way of competing within the firm as time advances. And it's not just inside the firm. Those choices and behaviours become embedded into the norms of the industry and into the value network in which the firm operates, among the expectations of its customers, of shareholders, of regulators and of analysts looking at that industries. Managers are expected to behave and act in a particular way and make choices that are rational given that understanding. To give you an example of how deep that dominant design of an industry approach can do, let's look at the QWERTY keyboard. Now the QWERTY keyboard was patented in 1878 to support the emerging typewriter industry. And this is when typewriters worked by pressing a key and a metal arm with the character embedded on it would be pushed up onto the paper to make a letter. And the QWERTY keyboard was designed to reduce the number of times that those metal arms would jam, and therefore would slow down typing. Now that innovation was effective, and so it was adopted by many typewriter manufacturers. And as that became standard, users of typewriters would train on that layout of keys, and get faster and faster at typing, such that if they came across a typewriter that did not have that layout, they were much slower and would make more mistakes. So as that ecosystem of typewriter design, trained typists, training of typists, that layout became the dominant design. Now, they didn't mean to say that as typewriter technology improved, other inventors didn't try to find layouts which were faster than the original QWERTY design. But that might have improved the typewriter. The cost of retraining typists and users of typewriters was too great for those layouts to be adopted, even if they were more efficient. As we moved into the digital age, the need to think about metal arms hitting paper to create a letter we've left far behind. And yet if you look at keyboards of today's computers, you'll find they are laid out in a QWERTY format. So the technological reason for having that design has long since disappeared. But because it's the dominant design, the norm, it still continues to be the default way in which to lay out a keyboard. And this just shows how a design can become dominant and then get locked in, where it is difficult, sometimes impossible, to change that design. Now, products and services and their production are a system comprised of two elements. First element is the individual components that make up that product or service and their production. And the second element is the architecture, how those components are integrated together. I'll give you an example. If you look at a cooling fan, well, the components of a cooling fan are the blades, the motor, the electronics, the cabling that brings power to it. Those are all components of that product. The architecture of that product is the way in which those components are put together. And so a desk fan will have a very different architecture to a ceiling fan. Both have the same components, but those components are put together in a different way and used in a different fashion. Now, innovation can take place at both an architectural level and at a component level. At an architectural level, that change could be in terms of moving from ceiling fans to desktop fans. At a component level, it might be in the materials you use for the blades, or in the functionality in the electronics controlling the fan. Now, as the life cycle of a product and service advances, the architecture becomes embedded in the dominant design for that product. Now, initially, when a new product or service is introduced, the components and the architecture are in a great deal of flux. There's a lot of variation in terms of the components that make up the product and the way in which they're put together. But as that product develops, standardization occurs, particularly in the architecture, and through that a dominant design that's accepted across the industry develops. And as more and more products are produced to that design, the architecture becomes taken for granted. No one challenges that it can be done in a different way. And competition focuses in on changing the specification, in changing components, and the efficiency with which those components work together. Now, we can see this in the car industry. If you go back to the early days of motoring at the end of the 1800s, you'll see wide variation in both the architecture of a so-called car and the components used. three-wheeled cars, steam-driven cars, six-wheeled cars, cars with the driver at the back rather than the front, cars that look like horse carriages. But as the car industry developed, you saw greater standardization coming in. So by the 1920s, you were seeing cars adopting the format we know today with four wheels and the driving position at the front. Although still quite a bit of variation in terms of the design and look of the car. As we come further forward into the 1970s, we are seeing more standardization in terms of the architecture and the production process that sits behind that. Still some variation with the Volkswagen Beetle and the bubble car, but then we come up to today's cars and we see a great deal of similarity between cars, with competition taking place on the latest features in the car or its performance. And the design of the car is pretty much taken for granted. So the architecture of the offering is locked in such that strategic decisions made by managers in firms are constrained. And so when faced with a change, will tend to prompt responses that are linked to components rather than challenging the underlying architecture of the industry. Now, as we saw in the last study unit, the strategy literature is divided on whether and how firms can respond to that lock-in into a dominant design. As we looked at in the last study unit, one branch of the literature says that if firms adopt the right approach, they can radically change and so escape from that trap. Other elements of the literature, though, say that actually the barriers to change in some situations are just too great and firms are not able to respond fast enough. And this is the area that we will look at in the next video. See you then.